Hi, everyone. With this, I finally wanted to get around to my review of It by Stephen King. And after having sat through a couple of seminars with in my grad program, it's also lent me an interesting perspective on what it means to be, say, Gothic, and so maybe I want to incorporate a little bit of that too, just for fun. Also, just to help me kind of process what we've been discussing in those seminars. So I hope you find that interesting as well. I won't go terribly overboard with it, I hope. But in any case, yeah, as far as Stephen King's It goes, I liked it, which is also interesting because at this level academically, people generally aren't interested in whether or not someone likes something or not. The idea that, hey, if a critic were to write something about something else, say I wrote about Titus Andronicus, which I have in front of me at the moment, and I said, well, according to how I feel about this, I really liked that play. It's a great play. Or a critic wrote something about that play, then I would be like, I really liked what that critic wrote. Or an online critic on YouTube. I think that's a little bit more germane to the people that I'm addressing right now. You guys, if someone like Angry Joe said, "Hey, Titus Andronicus is Shakespeare's best play," and I said, "You know what, Angry Joe? I like that you said that, or I like your video, or whatever." Academically speaking, in the words of one of my professors, no one cares about that. Rather, what ultimately matters in a situation isn't just the dichotomy of liked or didn't like, but rather, does the argument that you're making hold water? Is it sustainable? And ultimately, I don't like to just say, okay, hey, I liked a movie, for instance, thumbs up or thumbs down. I want to be able to talk about it in a way that is sustainable or that makes sense or is thought provoking. And that's where I'm going with this is it's not just about liking a movie or disliking a movie. And I know that that kind of runs countercurrent to the way that a lot of critics on YouTube or anywhere else online, or even professional critics, where it's constantly a grading scale that they use to motivate consumers, where it's, again, thumbs up, thumbs down, or it's a letter grade or a number grade of some sorts that they use to kind of convince people very rapidly that something is good or bad, or that they liked it or didn't like it. And beyond that, they don't always delve into arguments that are terribly convincing in and of themselves, short of comparing it to, say, something else. But they don't always do a lot more than that. And as far as I'm concerned, from like a literary critical standpoint, that's kind of lazy. So again, I just want to say that with this review, I'm going to try and say more than just, hey, I liked the movie, because point in fact, Stephen King's It, I did like the film. I enjoyed it, but ultimately, what I think that matters in this situation is why I liked it, and why should you care beyond that. So, without further ado, Stephen King's It. It was good. It was good film. I enjoyed it a great deal for a lot of different reasons. One reason that I liked it immediately is that it was R-rated. An R-rated horror film, I think, is ultimately almost always going to be more effective. There are maybe one or two examples that people might say aren't R-rated that still work really well. I don't always agree with these exceptions to the rule, say Signs by M. Night Shyamalan or The Sixth Sense. where people say that those are really good films and they're not R rated. At least I think Signs was PG 13. And I want to say that The Sixth Sense was actually R rated, but maybe it didn't really feel that R rated to me. But, or Hitchcock films, Psycho. I don't think that was an R rated film. And yet at the same time it's a horror classic. Or Jaws. I'm pretty sure Jaws wasn't R rated either. If I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that film was PG, but it was a Spielberg PG, and he took great delight, or rather, did not really think too hard about what he was putting in his films beyond making them good. And I think he was able to, compose or create a mixture that people weren't always immediately going to just categorize as R rated. And yet at the same time, it wasn't really for kids necessarily. But there you go. There are a couple of examples of horror films that aren't necessarily R, but then again, you have to look at it from like a historical point of view. I mean, because PG versus then versus PG now is radically different, because Spielberg PG isn't anything like a PG film that gets made nowadays, because the rating system is much more concrete now. And I'm not saying it's more effective necessarily. I think that it actually kind of trammels or prohibits the filmmaking process. So in regards to Stephen King's it was R rated. So that right off the bat, I think helps. Now that doesn't guarantee anything in regards to it being a good horror film, because there are plenty of horror films out there that suck, that are bad horror films that are rated R. And you take any of the remakes of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, for instance, they're all R rated, but they're all equally bad in their own special ways. Like they just kind of fall short of the original, which was an R rated film. And it worked for that film worked for a lot of reasons. But if it had been PG or PG 13, which if they had perhaps, I think the one reason that film was R rated was it wasn't because of the gore, because there really wasn't any, and it had more to do with subject matter, because they shot most of the film in such a way that you couldn't really see anything. So, from a gorehound perspective, if you go into that film by Tobe Hooper and think to yourself, okay, hey, this is uh, an R-rated movie, so I'm told, you're going to be kind of disappointed, except for maybe one or two moments. It was like Prometheus with Ridley Scott, where you had this situation where it was advertised as an R-rated movie, and yet when you sit down and watch it, there's maybe one or two moments that are gloriously R-rated, and then the rest of it just feels kind of light in that respect. There just wasn't really a lot of gore or anything. And so a lot of times when people try and rate these things and they say, well, this movie's R rated, it's because of the subject matter. It's about this killer that kills people and um, with a chainsaw, and there's just a lot of it's really grim and dark, but it's not that gory. And again, the point I'm trying to make here is that movies can not always be the goriest films in existence, and yet they can still be R rated. And in the case of Stephen King's It, for instance, that movie didn't have the most gore on the planet. There were several moments that were gory, yes, but it wasn't what I would call a splatterhouse feature. It wasn't just a gore driven film. There were all of these moments that were kind of illustrating how the creature worked and how it would scare its individual targets. Each one of them was afraid of something different, and it had a different way of going about that. But there were a few moments that were kind of make you cringe a little bit. The kid when he breaks his arm, and they have to reset the bone. Um, or at the beginning of the film when Georgie gets his arm bit off. But these are really, comparatively speaking, compared to say Peter Jackson's Dead Alive, or even something like Braveheart by Mel Gibson, where there's a lot of gore. It's it ultimately falls kind of short in that regard. There was, of course, one moment in the film where the girl of the film is looking down her sink drain in the bathroom, and her hair shoots out of the drain, like her shed hair, and it wraps around her throat and pulls her close to the drain, and then all of his blood shoots up from the sink. And it really reminded me of Evil Dead 2, Dead by Dawn, where Ashley Williams, the hero of that movie, fires his shotgun into the wall and creates this hole, and then it starts to bleed, and then next thing you know, he's standing in front of a geyser of blood. And it really reminded me of that. But again, the idea that a geyser of blood, or an elevator full of blood, like another Stephen King adaptation, The Shining by Stanley Kubrick, it doesn't necessarily feel as R-rated to me as some films. I had to watch. It kind of reminds me of another film that I sat down and watched with my girlfriend called Fade to Black, which was this movie made in 1980, I believe, and it was about this film buff who starts to kind of disassociate reality with the movies that he's watching. And he goes around dressing up as classic Hollywood monsters or characters, and accidentally, or sometimes not so accidentally, kills people. And it, as far as that goes, it had these moments in the movie which were very I was trying to make a point with that. And I can't edit this. Oh dear. Uh, the idea that in it, for instance, you would have these moments where it didn't really feel that gory, and or it didn't really feel. It felt more like a reference to another horror film. And with The Shining, for instance, with the blood and the coming out of the elevator, and uh, if it was just that, again, it feels kind of gore and light. And then you have other films like the new It by Stephen King, or the new Stephen King adaptation by this upcoming director, where it kind of reminded me of Fade to Black, where you that movie was just chock full of horror references, and it wasn't. That was an example of a horror film that was very. It was very aware of the material that it was referencing, but it wasn't always the best executed, and it came off as kind of silly. Whereas in this latest film, it was actually really effective. I mean, there were a couple of things that just don't necessarily work depending on what gets your goat. So if you're not afraid of clowns, and you're not the kind of person that is really bothered by spooky imagery, because again, this film is a lot more focused on things other than just gore. It tries to be creepy, and it does have certain kinds of things that certain people don't like. It does have jump scares, but at the same time, I thought that the ones that they did have worked rather well, per se. And when a character turns around and then suddenly, oh, the clown is standing behind them, and then there would be a loud sound. This is no different than, say, Michael Myers in Halloween. Whenever he appears, there's an audio cue. It's not quite the same as a jump scare in that case, because it was the danger sound, like Jaws, where you have the Donna by was it John Williams who did the score for that movie? Please don't string me up and hang me if I got that wrong, but I believe it was John Williams. I don't know why I'm even questioning that, but the point is it's a musical cue. It's not exactly a jump scare, and there's a difference. But there were plenty of moments in Halloween bu- by John Carpenter that served as jump scares, where Michael Myers is hiding behind a car and Laurie Strode is walking. It wasn't Laurie Strode, it was Lindsay and the babysitter, whose name I can't remember, but she's the first one to go. She's killed in the car, and oh, I can't remember her name. I think the actress's name was Nancy Loomis, which is actually a stage name. But she was the one. She gets butter on her clothing, and then she has to try and wash her clothes, and then she gets stuck in the washing house, and Lindsay gets a call from so and so, and then she has to go to the washing house and rescue what's her name, and shit, I can't remember her name. Anyways, the point is this character is taking little Lindsay over to Laurie Strode's place because Laurie Strode is babysitting, and as she's doing this, Michael Meyer sort of jumps up from a car, but he does it out of the vision of the two characters. We can see it, but the other characters can't. And there's this very loud sound. It's a jump scare. It's not a musical cue. It's not the sound of the shape that plays whenever the shape appears on screen. It's something else. So even the greats did this, and it's not enough for me to say, hey, there's a jump scare in here. It's the kind of jump scare that people tend to associate as bad because there's something that happens, and you have to have a loud sound. And I remember Red Letter Media was really sort of taking this film to task over things like that. And yet, you want to know what one of their favorite films is? It's Star Wars. And in Star Wars, you have the opening shot of the film where the rebel ship is being chased down by the Star Destroyer. And you have all of this music and you have all of these sound effects in space. And one thing that gets talked about in regards to that scene is the sound effects don't always have to make sense. They're there to sell the shot. It's supposed to be exciting. It's like there's no sound in space, okay? And yet that scene is full of sound and music and all of this audio supplement that isn't. You could very easily do the Kubrick thing and just have no sound at all. But even Kubrick would have music. And it goes to show that music or sound effects play a important role, a supplementary role or a subsidiary role to the visuals, but you can't always just get rid of them. And you have to ask yourself, would this particular jump scare and it have worked better without the sound effects? And I think there are a couple of instances where they go a little bit heavy on the sound effects, but it was nothing near to the level that it felt clunky to the degree that you see in a lot of really bad horror films because there's more going on than just that. Okay, the part where it gets kind of annoying is where they're just doing jump scare sounds and nothing else. That's their only trick. But it had a lot of different things going on. Again, the idea that it was paying homage to all of these different things. A time period that may not be familiar to younger audience members, okay, where you have the 1980s and they had the fat kid of the group. Again, that trope from, say, the Goonies or the Monster Squad, where there's the fat, chubby kid of the group, and then there's the nerdy kid with the glasses. So if you watch Stephen King's The Body, Corey Feldman in that film played the nerdy kid with the glasses, and these types of tropes were something that he used in his own writing. So it's not like it's the filmmaker doing this, and it's just a case of the filmmaker paying homage to and being respectful to the source material, and I really appreciated that. And you can look at it and say, oh well, it's just a movie full of horror tropes. Yes, but it's also a book adaptation which contained the same tropes. So it's a question of being faithful or not being faithful. And with adaptations, you always have to say they don't have to do that. They could have reinvented it entirely, but then there wouldn't be anything left of Stephen King's original story. So it's a balancing act. And In regards to these jump scares, uh, again, there was a lot more than that. There were all of these things, this faithfulness to Stephen King's original material, and it was very consistent, and it really hinged on the performance of the characters, but also all of this pop culture kind of stuff that got weaved into it, but also the zeitgeist of the 80s. I mean, you have these kids riding around on their bikes and just little tiny details where at one point they're in the middle of the street and they're going to go somewhere to do some investigating. They all hop off their bikes and they all throw their bikes down onto the ground. Okay, any kid who ever owned a bike and rode around with other kids on bikes remembers doing this. You didn't just take the time to set your bike down neatly or have a kickstand. A lot of times you just kind of threw the bike down unceremoniously onto the ground. But the Jewish kid takes it and he kind of sets it down very neatly and he puts down his kickstand. It's just this tiny little detail, and yet it got a laugh from the audience, mainly from older members, because a lot of people could remember something like that, and it was a tiny little detail. And you had this moment, kind of like Dazed and Confused, where you have the hazing moment. You have uh, the girl who's sitting in the bathroom, and there are rumors circulating her that she's a slut, or that she's a bad girl, and the female bullies pour garbage into the stall, and it's really disgusting. But it really reminded me of Dazed and Confused, that hazing moment when school's out for the summer, and you have all the seniors who are hazing the freshmen. And I could think of other films like that as well, maybe something like 16 Candles or a John Hughes film or anything like that. Again, it's a trope from the 80s, and you could say, oh, well, it's stock, but it all comes together really well in this film. And it felt really effective because I was a kid from the mid 80s and the 90s that I remember all this stuff, and I can appreciate it. It's going to go over the heads of a lot of post millennial viewers. They're not going to know what the hell an 8-track player is, or vinyl, or they had a slide viewer where they were looking through like microfilm and things like that, and it or a projector, like an old school one from the 70s. And there was just all these different things. And the fat kid, though, I wanted to get back to that. He had this strange kind of obsession with Kids in the Hall. At least I think that was the name of the band, and I wasn't too familiar with them. But he didn't want anyone else to know about it. And the girl of the group puts on his headphones from his Walkman and sees that he's listening to this, and he's like, "Oh, don't tell anyone." And she's like, "Don't worry about it." But then she takes his yearbook and she signs her name in it. But as she's doing it, it's empty. I remember that in high school. No one signed my yearbook. Maybe like one or two teachers or something like that. So that was like a really. There were a lot of things in the film that really resonated to me. It's not just stock tropes that don't come from anywhere, and all of the characters had things like this that kind of fleshed them out, and they worked together as a unit. Movies like Goonies or The Monster Squad or anything like that, where you have a group of misfits or loser kids that band together to fight the monster. Again, this wasn't anything new back when King did it in the 80s, and it was very much something that he was kind of riffing off of. And this movie really captures that, though, the type of spirit or the type of writing devices that King was using. This film uses in a way that King would have. So not only does it capture the zeitgeist in a really faithful way, but it's very effective in its own right as a film, I think. And all of the performances of the actors and actresses worked really well. And there was this movie about kids that felt more like a movie about kids than, say, a PG film. This is where the R rating really shines, because you have the school bullies, for instance, who are bullying the chubby kid, and they pull out a knife and they're cutting him with the knife, and it felt like a really R rated moment because it's really uncomfortable. It's like a William Golding Lord of the Flies moment where it wouldn't have worked in a PG film or even a PG-13 film. It felt really intense, and these kids are being mean to each other. Like really mean. The way that it actually would happen in a real situation where you hear about bullying where it goes wrong and these kids are hitting each other and cutting each other, and you have to remind yourself that kids aren't these perfect little angels. They hurt each other, and there are plenty of memories that I have of bullies growing up where they were not nice to you and they would hurt you. And you hear about someone getting pushed and their leg gets broken. Or uh, I saw a movie with Katie Dickey called Red Road, where she was a security like supervisor for this station, and she would look through cameras, kind of like Rear Window, and she sees these prepubescent or pubescent girls that are ganging up on this solo individual, this other girl by herself. They're bullying her, and they pull a knife and stab her. Well, they're maybe 12, 13 years old, but that's a real thing that happened, and it felt very gritty, very real, in a way that a lot of kids' movies wouldn't if they were PG. This is where the R rating really works. There was a couple of actors that I recognized from Stranger Things, which also was a throwback to the 80s, the Zeitgeist of the 80s, and all of those tropes and things and it worked really well in Stranger Things, and it worked really well here. And in regards to you had one actor with glasses in it, and he was the one who was always saying fuck. I thought if you wanted to have a good drinking game, wait until that kid says fuck. They were gonna uh, jump off this ravine into a lake, just like in Stranger Things, and it's kind of a test of manhood or what have you. But you have all these kids standing around in their tighty whities, and then behind them they see that the girl, the cute girl, has followed them, and she's like, "You pussies!" And she takes off her clothes, and she's running towards them in her underwear, and it's in slow motion, and you can see that young male gaze as they're all staring at her body, and she jumps into the water, but then Four Eyes is like, "What the fuck?" And then everyone in the audience was laughing because it's genuinely funny, I thought, and it worked really well. And then afterwards, of course, she's sunbathing, and then you have this moment where all the guys are kind of checking her out because they're in this situation where there's a girl in front of them in her underwear, and they're just kind of like they'd never seen anything like that, or at least not anything that wasn't in their dad's Playboy or something like that. And it there's just all sorts of interactions like that are really funny or really touching or really just real. It's not just a writing device. It's the kind of shit that would actually happen growing up. At least for me, during that time period, I wasn't the most social kid, but I still have memories of that kind of thing, and it feels real, and it worked really well. And then, of course, I appreciated there's just all these nods to, again, things from the 80s, technology, cars. There's a fight scene with they're throwing rocks at each other from across the river. You had the bullies and then the misfits, and they square off and they start throwing rocks at each other, and it starts playing Anthrax's Antisocial. And I really, really enjoyed that. And then, of course, one of the bullies has an Anthrax shirt on. And so it was a very commercially aware film, too. There was just all this stuff in it. It was connected in such a way that it didn't feel it's not product placement because the things that it would be placing as products aren't for sale anymore. Okay, so it becomes a time capsule film, and as far as I'm concerned, it worked really well. And yeah, aside from that, these are things that I enjoy about the film that I could easily see other people criticizing for reasons that, okay, it's not original. Well, nothing's original anymore in this day and age. You're dealing with an adaptation where the source material is something that existed previously, and you're not necessarily reformatting it, but you're reshooting something with new actors and things like that, with the intent of looking back into the past to appreciate an older sort of approach to filmmaking. So a movie that gets made now in 2017 is paying homage to the 1980s in a way that I thought was rather effective. Does it get in the way of the narrative? No, it doesn't. It's a part of the narrative because it was a part of what Stephen King would have been writing about when he wrote the novel. And again, it's a time capsule kind of film, and it does it with great respect or reverence. But all the jokes land because I'm from that time, and I recognize these jokes, and all of the people in the audience did, and it was successful in that regard. There was a great amount of chemistry with all of the squad members. Okay, just like the Goonies or the Monster Squad, where you have all these kids on screen, and it's essentially it's either ad lib or you're reading from a script. Regardless of how you're going about it exactly, it hinges entirely on the chemistry between the characters, and all of these characters work together rather well. Each member was sharply drawn, but they didn't really feel like any one of them was. It was an acephalous group. The idea of a group without a head or a leader, and they all kind of carried their weight. Now there was one or two characters that I thought worked perhaps not necessarily better in the sense that other characters were weaker, but they just kind of went the extra mile. So if I had to say what was a stronger character or what was a character that maybe got a little bit more screen time, it was the female character of the group. And she was the one that wasn't scared of the clown. Of course, they have the damsel in distress moment, but I didn't mind that. Red Letter Media said that hey, this was one of the weaker moments of the film where she gets captured and then everyone has to go and rescue her. But again, this is a film that is paying homage to the writing tropes of the 80s, and the damsel in distress trope in the 1980s would have been prevalent. And this would have been something that perhaps King himself would have used in some shape or form. So it didn't bug me. And on top of this, the creature was powerful. It was physically powerful, and it's able to hunt people down individually, and it worked because why didn't it just kill her right off the bat? Like Georgie earlier in the film, and there's always going to be a little bit of inconsistency with rules and things like this in film because was Georgie arguably afraid before it bit his arm off? No, I'm not entirely sure, but there was a certain uneasiness watching Georgie trying to get his boat back. Perhaps that was enough. And at the same time, I got the feeling that the creature found children easier to feed on because children are easier to scare sometimes. And this girl was coming of age, and she just wasn't afraid of it the way that some of the other characters were because there was some discrepancy in the ages of these kids too. And when it had her right where it wanted her ostensibly, she said, "I'm not afraid of you," and she wasn't afraid of it. And it said, "You will be," and then it casts a spell on her to essentially use her as bait, dangling bait. And some of the other kids in this situation are much more susceptible to being afraid. It really reminded me of The Devil's Backbone towards the end of the film, where you have these kids who are grabbing weapons from this pile of refuse from earlier victims, like baseball bats and sticks and what have you, and they are going to town on this clown. They're just beating the crap out of it. And in The Devil's Backbone, you have this bully who's an asshole throughout the entire film, and then the rest of the kids at this orphanage have had enough, and they all grab spears and they stick him, and they give it to him, and then eventually, of course, he's claimed by the ghosts of the asylum and that or that orphanage, which I believe was a mental asylum before it was sort of repurposed as a orphanage, and there were ghosts here. It was a ghost story, and it really, again, I was reminded of that film by Guillermo del Toro when I was watching this, where these kids have had enough. They're like, Four Eyes says, "God damn it, you punched me in the face earlier. You made me go to this spooky fucking house full of clowns." And it's like, man, you've been a real asshole. And now you're going to make me kill this clown. And he grabs a baseball bat. And it's that one moment where you expect him to be a smartass, but he's actually being kind of serious. And there's all sorts of moments like this that work really well due to the actors and the chemistry. And I thought uh, it didn't bother me that again you had various things like damsels in distress or product placement or the squad trope like the Goonies or things like this. I thought it worked very well given the tools that they had to work with. It's very equivalent to say you're in drama class and you have a table full of props and they say, okay, it's improv time, folks, in drama class, and all the props that you have are from the 1980s, and all of the characters that you're supposed to improvise are from the 1980s. Okay, do it in a way that works. And I felt that it was a very good example of that. And it didn't feel improvised though. It was a very well put together film, and all of the performances worked really well. It did feel a little bit long in spots because again, every single member of the squad had his own side story, his own backstory. Some of them felt a little bit short, and I thought, maybe they could have had one or two less members of the squad just so that it felt like each member was getting equal screen time if you're going for that acephalous kind of feel in regards to their group. But even so, it didn't really bother me all that much. And they're able to, like, it's very holistic, and they're able to address all these different things in regards to the nature of fear. And that this clown, it's not just a fear of clowns. They had a lot of moments in the trailer, for instance. And I don't like to do this, okay? I don't like to attack a film based on its trailer. And Red Letter Media, again, was saying if you watch the trailer, you have basically all of the, note for note, all of the moments in the film where, oh, here's this scary moment, or here's this scary moment. And you can just kind of watch the film and expect that. But I thought there were plenty of moments in the film that weren't in any of the trailers. And it's like, okay, maybe I knew this scare. I was able to recognize that from the trailer in the same sense that I watched Alien Covenant. I'm like, okay, here's the backburster part, or here's the part of the film where the xenomorph is on the loading platform. That shot that they use in all the advertising and marketing and things like that. It didn't prevent me from enjoying the film. It's like, okay, that element of surprise is gone, and yet the film was still genuinely funny. It really understood fear, I think, and the idea that, okay, clowns in and of themselves aren't necessarily scary to everyone, which is why I think the film works really well, because all of the children were afraid of different things, and the clown could assume different shapes. Its most prevalent shape, is that of a clown, but at the same time, it assumed the role of the flautist woman. The woman with the really weird face and sharp teeth, and she would play this flute, and it was kind of creepy. And I talked to a friend of mine in the UK where I'm staying presently, and she said that was creepier for her than the clown. I talked. There was an MA student at the seminar Rise of the Gothic. Maybe there's eight or nine of us with a professor in a room, and we're talking about these different things, and we talk about cinema occasionally. And they said one of their scariest experiences cinematically was watching It. To which I recommended, oh, you should go and see the new film. And she's like, are you kidding? I saw the original, back in the day, and that scared the living daylights out of me. I don't think I'd be able to handle it. And it just goes to show that I wasn't really that scared of clowns, and I'm not. But there was Four Eyes in the film who was terrified of clowns. And you might watch that sequence and go to yourself, that's not really that scary. But it was done in such a way that it wasn't just thrusting a clown into your face. There would be buildup. Four Eyes is in this room where he's surrounded by all of these stationary dolls. It reminded me of Blade Runner, where Deckard is in the room and Pris is waiting, hiding. And then at the last moment, there's this sort of Jack in the Box kind of moment where she kicks him and knocks him over and then attacks him. And it was very similar in execution in this film. It took its time though with Four Eyes when he's in this room full of clown paraphernalia, and he is um, essentially you're waiting for that jump scare. It's very Hitchcockian. Okay, it's not the bomb going off that works. It's waiting for it to go off. And this movie had plenty of instances of that, where you would have the clown, and it is chasing the boy in the sewer, and he lights this match, and then as he's lighting this match, he hears the voices of the people floating in the sewer, and then he's like, ha ha ha, very funny, guys. But then when he lights the match, you can see in the distance their faces, and they're all rotten. They're the undead, But you only see just enough to realize that he's surrounded by all of these undead people. And it works. The idea, the use of darkness to kind of conceal what's frightening, to make it even more frightening by using your imagination to sort of fill in the gaps. So he runs away, but then as he's running away, he turns around because these bars are blocking his path, and he is imprisoned. And when he turns around, he sees a red balloon drifting towards him. And then as it breaks, where earlier in the shot you see there was nothing behind the balloon, but when it gets close up to the camera, it blocks your view of what's behind it. So when it pops, suddenly the clown is behind it. It's a nice little visual trick, and it's not necessarily something that's going to scare everyone, because you could expect it, or you might have even seen it in the trailer, though I don't recall that one particular instance. And that's another thing I want to talk about is the clown. The clown design in and of itself, the performance of Bill Skarsgård, and I thought it worked really well. It just, he was suitably creepy. He was very consistent. The makeup effects were really good, and it wasn't. I didn't want to compare it to Tim Curry's performance in the original film, because it's like, look, okay, it's like comparing Heath Ledger's Joker to um, Jack Nicholson's or any of the other Joker incarnations that have existed. There isn't really much of a point beyond serving confirmation bias. Okay, where it's like, hey, I liked this version, so I'm going to make the comparison to prove that. Okay, I'm not interested in that. That's not interesting. What did I liked. I liked Bill Skarsgård's version because Tim Curry was creepy, and he really sold the performance like he was having fun with it. And with Bill Skarsgård, I thought he was going a little bit more for something a little less of the zany or over the top. There were moments of that, but he reminded me of an adaptation of The Scarecrow for The Wizard of Oz. It was a stage play where there was something a little bit off about the costumes for the Scarecrow and the Tin Man. And you compare it to the MGM classic version of it, where it was, you had the Tin Man and you had the Scarecrow, and they're very bright and technicolor and colorful, and it's kind of happy and cute. And there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing uncanny about it. And Bill Skarsgård felt like a clown from a different era, where clowns weren't always funny, and it represents that idea of Freud's uncanny. And I'm not saying that it doesn't work that way with Tim Curry, because again, you have something that's really bright and colorful and fun, whereas because it was very uncanny with a different kind of makeup, no pun intended. Whereas with Bill Skarsgård, he was his color palette was very subdued, except for the red of the balloon or his nose, and with his outfit, it was very drab. But the performance, the makeup was great, and but his performance was very consistent, and he had his body language was excellent. And there was this moment with Georgie where he's talking with Georgie, he's trying to seduce him, but then he just stops and stares at him, and he's like drooling, and it was a very, very strong performance for what they were trying to go for. I thought, okay, you couldn't really do much of a better job. He wasn't trying to imitate Tim Curry. He gave his own kind of performance, but he kind of knocked it out of the park, all things considered. It was very consistent. There wasn't a moment where his accent faltered, his body language, his facial expressions, they all worked really well. And the only thing that I really disliked was the some of the digital effects, when they would occur, sort of drew attention to themselves the way that they always do. There were a lot of practical effects in the film, The idea where you have kids standing across the river from one another, throwing rocks at one another. I'm pretty sure that they were probably styrofoam or something like that, but they look real. And then, of course, you augment them with sound effects. Again, the idea of visuals augmented with sound effects to make it even more effective. And there were moments like that where they used some really great traditional practical effects, but then they also had plenty of moments where they had the scare moments where the clown would try and reach into these children's minds, and he would pull out something that was kind of cartoonish, almost like making a balloon animal. And it's kind of ridiculous, and it didn't always work from a special effects standpoint 100%. But there were some awesome special effects with the clown when he was getting ready to feed, and he had this long row of overlapping pointed teeth, and then when he tries to scare the girl, and his face basically turns inside and out, and he has these hypnotic lights, almost like binary stars in a solar system. That's what they look like, these lights of different size. And you stare into that and you're like, wow, that looks really cool. Which is great because in Stranger Things you had the flower faced monster that kind of reminded me of the same design, and yet it didn't look nearly as good. So you could kind of see where the money went with the digital special effects in it. And those moments work really well. But even in the days of practical effects, you could also see where the budget went. Or I saw a film on Netflix recently called The Void, which had these practical uh, monster schlock moments. And there's this point early on where this monster grabs a hold of this guy, and it really reminded me of The Thing. And it gouges out his eyes, and it's just going to town on him and mutilating him. And it's this gigantic sort of monstrosity, very, very, very much out of the Lovecraft sort of mythos or The Thing by John Carpenter. And it looked practical, but it didn't. The money wasn't quite there to kind of disguise some of what you were looking at. It's like you could. It's like seeing the garden hose in Sam Raimi's Evil Dead, where it's like, yeah, it's practical, but it doesn't. The point of cinema is kind of to somewhat disguise what you're looking at. You don't want to think, oh, that's a special effect. Say in James Cameron's Aliens, where they have the forced perspective shot when they're making their way into the hive. You tell me, man, I only work here. And then there's a transition where you see the quote unquote ceiling over the camera, and then you see the actual set that the actors are moving through. The ceiling is fake, but you don't think that. The best special effects are the ones that don't necessarily draw attention to themselves. And there were some special effects in it that did draw attention to themselves. But if they did, a good portion of the time, the quality of the effects allowed you to appreciate what you were looking at. Not always, but at the same time, what you're dealing with is magic. Okay, and if you had a sorcerer throw an analog fireball across the screen in a 1980s film, you'd be like, okay, that's obviously a special effect, but there's something else going on top of just trying to conceal the fact that, hey, this is magic. There's no way to really hide that. When you watch a Harry Potter film, the effects look really cartoonish sometimes because what you're dealing with is cartoonish. Okay, you're dealing with wizards and wands and fireballs. It's not a grounded kind of magic. It's very cartoonish. It's very in your face. And in it, the moments where the special effects were weaker were again this idea of the clown having this balloon animal type of approach to fear, where it would change, it would reveal something scary to the child, and in such a way that it felt magical. And there were moments that didn't rely on special effects at all that worked better, I think. But all in all, the money for a lot of these magical or cartoonish moments in the film worked, and it was mixed with good pacing and good sound effects, things like that. What I mean by that is there would be moments where it's just sound effects or it's just the actors on screen and there's nothing magical going on, and it would build up to these moments of cartoonish kind of magic, and it worked. I'm not saying it's perfect, but no film is really perfect. Ridley Scott's Alien, for instance, I watched that movie, I still can see moments where the special effects don't really work that well. So even in the classics, you have to rely on other things besides just the special effects. For instance, for it to sort of carry the film. Okay, it's not, and that's why it is such a great movie. You're relying on all of these different things, a composite body of different elements to give the film buoyancy. So you have special effects, you have chemistry between the actors, you have an adaptation that is faithful to the original writer or the Zeitgeist of the 80s. It's done with reverence, and at the same time, you have Bill Skarsgård as it, Pennywise the clown, who is kind of doing his own thing with it and giving us something a little bit different and doing a pretty damn good job of it, if I do say so myself. So these are all reasons why I think the film works, in spite of what some people might say in regards to it feeling as though everything is given away in the trailers. That's not the film's fault, okay? And you have to keep in mind Terminator 2 with James Cameron, what happened with the trailer for that? They gave away who was the good Terminator and who was the bad Terminator in the trailer. Would that stop you from enjoying that film? No. You go and watch it, and the film is trying to essentially fool you or play around with the idea, okay, who's good, who's bad in this situation. So when you have the confrontation underneath the Galleria with Arnold Schwarzenegger walking towards John Connor and the T-1000 walking towards John Connor, they're both drawing their firearms. It doesn't work if you had seen the trailer and you know exactly what's going on, but the execution is still effective in the film. Okay, and after a first viewing, you're going to know who's good and who's bad anyways. And if you're watching a film with a repeat viewing, it's not going to hinge on that whodunit kind of mentality, okay? It's about the skill of the film. So when people attack a film due to its marketing, it doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, Alien Covenant was another movie that had a lot of marketing that was very much something that was used as ammunition to bash the film. It is another instance of this, and it just doesn't doesn't really make any sense to me to do that, because again, you want to weigh a film based on what it is, its own merits, what we get on screen while watching the movie, not something different, not the trailer for the movie. Okay, if I watch the trailer to 1979's Alien by Ridley Scott, the trailer is fabulous, but the tone and feel is slightly different from the movie. It really is. In some ways, I think the trailer is actually scarier than the film, and you have plenty of disconnected, disjointed moments. It's a truncated version of the film with its own kind of feel, its own kind of music, okay? And I sit down and watch that, and it reveals all sorts of things about the movie. You can recognize these moments, okay? At the same time, I do think that it's a little bit better at concealing some of the money shots of its particular film than, say, the trailer for It or the trailer for Covenant. But even with those films, it doesn't stop me for enjoying them any more than me having seen the trailer for Terminator 2. Okay? At the end of the day, after having seen the film, that first impression or that initial disappointment is going to give way to gradual appreciation for something if you watch it repeatedly. And I think, okay, if you go into a film and you're the type of person that only watches movies once, you're going to carry around a lifetime supply of disappointments, because you'll never allow yourself to actually sit down and appreciate something, which can only happen with repeated viewings. Okay, cinematic hermeneutics. Okay, in order to study something, to know what it is, to appreciate it, you have to watch it more than once. And I think that a lot of critics don't, because they have a tendency or an expectation as critics to constantly watch movies one time, then move on to the next film, and constantly give reviews because they're trying to generate content for their channels. Okay, but which is why, if I'm really genuinely interested in someone who watches films and I want something that is more interesting than just, oh, I like this or I didn't like this, I would want someone who really understood the genre and understood it due to having seen something more than once. I would much rather hear the opinions on someone who had seen Near Dark by Catherine Bigelow 20 times, as opposed to someone who had seen it once and they saw it after having seen The Lost Boys. So you have that bias. and they watched it when they were older as opposed to when they were younger. And what they're going to say isn't necessarily going to be as interesting to me necessarily unless they're able to talk about it in a way that they connect it to what they already know and are familiar with. So someone who say only watched classic black and white Hollywood films, The Thing from Another World or Casablanca or Nosferatu. That's not a Hollywood film, but you know what I mean. Classic vintage movies. And then they went on to watch something as kind of an experiment. It might yield an interesting point of view. But in terms of the point of view being that of someone who actually knows what they're talking about based on what they regularly watch, it's not going to be that. And I think to myself, okay, I feel like a lot of critics, when they bash things, again, they have a tendency to sort of just say, look, my first impression of the movie wasn't that good. But I guarantee you, if they sat down to watch the movie again and they forgot about the trailers and the marketing, and they just kind of allowed themselves to keep an open mind and watch the film, you'd be surprised how different their opinion isn't necessarily implacable. It's not set in stone. It would actually change because first impressions generally give way to more lenient responses later on. And I've movies that are universally sort of reviled critically, like Alien Resurrection, for instance, by Jean-Pierre Jeunet. I can go back and watch that movie and find things to like about it, even if overall my impression of it is going to remain rather low, just because there are better movies out there for reasons that I can argue. But my first impression or initial letdown, again, which was due to watching a really awesome trailer with Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, which Dead Space ripped off years later, worked really well. And it had the really badass kind of trailer music. And there were plenty of moments in the film that looked really cool. Okay, just the way that they put it together, it looked awesome. But then when you watch the film, you realize that it doesn't work nearly as well as the trailer did. The trailer got my hopes up, and I was let down. And I went back to watching Alien and Aliens because those are my two favorite films in the franchise, up until you get to Prometheus and Covenant. It's a whole nother can of worms. And the idea is with it's the same way, okay? I know some people might watch the film or they might hear about people who watch the film and they're let down or they're disappointed. And I would say to those individuals, go and watch the film yourself. Just like I said in regards to Alien Covenant, don't let critics dissuade you from seeing a film that, as far as I'm concerned, is really well put together. It's carried by good performances, good chemistry, an effective performance by a villain who isn't just trying to recreate the same old Pennywise. He doesn't try and be Tim Curry. He's his own thing. All of the actors and the actress in the film, they work together as an acephalous group, delivering individual performances that are memorable, each in and of themselves. Each character had something that they brought to the table. They had some type of issue that they were trying to contend with. And there were other secondary villains in it that worked equally well. Pennywise was great, but some of the school bullies were chilling. People that I could relate to. They felt real to me. The instance where the chubby kid is being tortured by the bully really, really worked for me in a way that, say, Pennywise wouldn't have exactly. It felt more real to me. And the movie was full of instances like this. The female member of the group, her biggest fear was her father, who was sexually abusive in a way that was implied. It wasn't explicit necessarily, but whenever he was on screen, I felt that tension, that fear. I know plenty of women who have been sexually abused, plenty of people that have been hurt by men in situations like that. And I recognized it in such a way, but it didn't beat it over your head, at least not initially. But you could feel it. Okay, and it's about atmosphere. It's about creating fear. And not every instance of Pennywise's bag of tricks is going to evoke that response in you. Okay, but given that there's so much variety, there's so many different fears that the film is addressing, I think, yes, it's a very effective horror film for that. Apart from the technicalities, the execution, the tools that it uses to bring these fears to life, but just the commentary on fear and that is different per individual. and that everyone is afraid of something else, but then facing those fears. I shall not fear. Fear is the mind killer, the little death that leads to total obliteration. Dune, Paul Atreides, right? Put your hand in the box. What's in the box? Pain. And I think to myself, okay, great. That's a great moment in an otherwise sort of checkered science fiction film. I like it a lot, and I might review it someday because it's awesome. But it's not perfect. But in the exploration of fear, that scene in that film worked really well. And I think that in Stephen King's it's ultimately about an exploration of what scares us and that it's different per person. But at the end, facing facing the fears that are manifested by this demonic kind of clown, it works really well. And the way that when you're watching the film, you might say to yourself, hey, this isn't scary to me. The clown isn't scary to me. And there are certain moments where it's not as frightening. But the way that it would present it in such a way that you don't necessarily know what's going on. And these kids are seeing these unreal type of experiences. It feels dreamlike or feels sudden. And then one thing is happening and it's not explained right away. There's no exposition. These kids have to figure this out like a puzzle. And it does it in a way that I think works rather well. I don't like narration. Okay, 9 times out of 10, it just doesn't work. There's maybe one or two instances where it does, but there wasn't an instance where you had someone saying, "This is how the clown works." At the start of the film, you can have once upon a time there was a monster that lived under a bridge and it terrorized children. It worked in Del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth, but that was a fairy tale kind of film. And again, this is a film about monsters killing children. It's not that far removed, but a big difference in the delivery of the narrative is that in one instance, you don't have a narrator. These children have to figure this out themselves. And when you have these events unfolding on screen, you're wondering to yourself why, what's going on. And as far as I'm concerned, that's an interesting viewing experience because you have an instance where you're presented with something that isn't necessarily scary in and of itself, but there is an interaction with the audience and what they're watching in such a way that it works a certain part of your brain. You start to imagine or you start to wonder, okay, let's figure this out. And then you realize, okay, the reality of the situation is different than that. Just like an Alien, where you're wondering what's going on. Why is there this snake? And then suddenly it's like a man. It's big, and you're imagining as you're watching these things, and they might not be scary in and of themselves. Some people might be frightened by the chestburster sequence in Alien, but they won't necessarily be frightened by the sequence later on where Brett is killed in the Hall of Chains. It's not scary per se, but Chris Stuckman, when he was talking about that film, he liked the director's cut where you had the alien hiding in plain sight and there was no musical cue. I call it the shape scare, where you have moments where the shape is hiding in the background and there is no musical cue. Or Carrie, where the mother at the very end of the film is hiding in the background after Carrie has returned from the dance. And you see this kind of thing in The Babadook, where the child is hiding in plain sight and the mother walks past and the child isn't trying to make any sound. So it wasn't just unique to that particular director's cut, but it's the kind of thing that Chris Stuckman really appreciated, okay? But there are certain people that really appreciate the first half of Alien, but not the second. So appreciation is different per individual. And in regards to the seminars that I've been attending, to the explanation of the Gothic, right? Historically, Gothic was a political tool it was a word, a buzzword, a political buzzword to sort of validate the people who replaced the Stuart kings. Okay, the Jacobean Stuart kings were replaced by William of Orange, and you had the bloodless, the Glorious Revolution, where the Protestants essentially upended the Catholics and assumed their sovereign sort of role over ruling England, and yet they were interested in having parliamentary procedure and not just the divine right of kings, but they had to invent a Gothic myth of ancestry to sort of justify this, and that the Goths existed in England and that England was its own thing. Okay, it wasn't tied to classical antiquity, the Greeks and the Romans. It was the Goths of England, who never actually existed in England. They were wrongly attributing the Jutes and the Normans and the Saxons as being inherently Gothic, but they weren't. Okay, but it was this word that was invented to kind of create this narrative to suit their political purposes. Okay, but at the same time, there were people who resisted this during the Renaissance period or the Dark Ages, and they would say that Goths were, or the word Gothic pertained to something that was ugly or crude or barbaric. And then later on, you had Alexander Pope, who said Shakespeare is a Gothic poet. He's a poet of the Gothic tradition, and it's something that is inherently English. Okay, it's not Greco-Roman, and it pertains to the supernatural, and it's rugged, but it's us. It's England. Okay, even though the Goths never existed in England, he's like, let's appreciate this. The point that I'm trying to make here with this tangent towards the content during this summary, the rise, or the seminar, the summary of the seminar, the rise of the Gothic and Gothic history, is that it meant different things for different people. Okay, this word, it was opposite things, in fact, during the rise of that particular movement, and that it's the nature of language for you. And with something like the nature of fear, it's very much the same kind of thing. Fear, people respond to fear differently, just like they define Gothicism differently. There may be one or two universal fears: the fear of death. Conscience makes cowards of us all, to be or not to be. But even in instances like that, one's fear of death can be superseded by one's desire not to live or to know that country that no one returns from, that idea, that undiscovered country, uh, and the idea that fears can be overridden, fears can be conquered, or fears can be initially be perceived as whatever scares us, which is different per individual. And that's how it works. And even with the great classic films like Alien, you have that. Even with something like the new It, you have that. It's an exploration of fears that respond differently per individual of that group. And I think it really, really nails that idea. Okay, forget the jump scares, forget all the classic sort of tropes and the adaptation of Stephen King's novel, The Zeitgeist of the 80s. You could forget about all of that and just look at it as an exploration of what scares us. And it really understands the nature of fear, and that it's different per individual, but that fear is something that you can surmount, that you can defeat. And it's important, I think, and it's a central part to the message of the film, and it does so in a way that's really effective. It doesn't have this tacked on exposition. It does it in such a way that you have to kind of figure it out as the film goes along, and it's very solid. And I can't really recommend the film enough as far as that goes. I can't assign it a number score or a letter grade. I mean, okay, I'll give it an A. There, it's an A film. That doesn't mean anything. Just go and watch the film for yourself and decide what of it scares you, or what of it you can appreciate. Because I know that there are plenty of horror fans who are post millennials. One of my flatmates, Alicia, is a 19-year-old from Bordeaux. She loves horror films, okay? But she's not going to recognize or identify with this Zeitgeist from the American 1980s. It's not going to resonate with her the same way that it does with me, but it doesn't mean that she couldn't identify or find something to be scared of in the film, or find something to provoke her thoughts while she's watching the film. An engagement between the viewer and the thing being viewed. And there's a lot of engagement going on with it, which is ultimately why I think it's an effective film. Anyways, guys, I'm going to cut the video short here. It's getting pretty long. And in any case, I hope you enjoyed my review of the film, and that you didn't find my incorporation of various Gothic studies that I'm conducting right now in my graduate work. I hope you didn't find that too intrusive or kind of annoying. But I felt it important, something that I want to address as a master's student right now.
But if you like the video, like, share, and subscribe. I certainly plan on doing more of these. I've sort of settled into a routine, so I am able to kind of organize my time and find ways to sort of address or talk about these things uh, in a way that kind of adheres to a schedule. So there, basically, that's just a long way of me saying that there will be more reviews and videos in the future. So again, like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Share this video with your friends and people that you think might be interested in what I have to say about film. It makes a great deal of difference, I think, if you're helping share my content with others. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and until then, stay tuned. Take care, guys.